Thank you. Just wait for the presentation to come up. Super. Well, if you had any doubts whether you'd be energetic enough, just in the lead up to dinner, I think Dan has put paid to those doubts. Thanks, Dan, for setting us off on a brilliant start. If Dan asked us provocatively, what is our respective theories of change, but outlined his principles, maybe in my presentation, I will try to see or explain how some of those principles you outlined, Dan, can be operationalized. So the what and the how kind of playing. In India, we call it the jugalbandi, the do-it. So here goes. In my presentation, I have titled it Accelerating Energy Transitions. And it's very important that we recognize there's not one, but many different energy transitions that are underway, particularly in the developing world. And we've got to be not just cognizant about them, but imaginative in the innovations we deploy towards them. As a way of introduction, I mentioned earlier, I represent CEEW. Our work is not just on energy. Many of the issues we've been discussing through the day, whether it's air or water or food or mobility or cooling, finance, technology, it's all part of our portfolio of work in India and outside India. But today, I will focus my comments on the energy transitions. So let me explain why I say that there are the energy transitions as plural. Normally, we've thought about the shift towards sustainable energy as a binary, that you have dirty energy and you move to clean energy. When we look at developing countries, the first energy transition is from no modern energy to modern energy. That's energy transition number one. Let me illustrate this with an example. In 2015, when the Sustainable Development Goals were announced, we came out with the results from a survey that at that time it was the world's largest survey we had undertaken on energy access. And India had the dubious distinction of having the largest number of people without access to electricity. In 2017, a program was launched to connect households, not just villages, to at least a wire. Whether an electron flows through it or not was a subsequent question. So in 18 months, 28 million households were electrified. Effectively, that means that 11,000 human beings in India got access to a wired connection every hour. Now, the world has still 700 million people without access to electricity. We would need to electrify 11,500 human beings every hour all the way to 2030 to meet just one aspect of SDG 7. So what India did in an 18-month period with intense effort, the world has to do this for the remainder of this decade every single hour. The first energy transition is from no energy to energy. The second is that the patterns of energy demand will shift quite a bit, especially in developing countries as rural populations shift to urban areas. And therefore, what is primarily agricultural demand of energy then moves towards heating and cooling for buildings such as these, transportation systems, and so forth. The third energy transition then is about the shift from dirty energy towards cleaner energy, or dirtier growth towards more sustainable growth. And the fourth energy transition that is almost never talked about is actually the deeper integration of developing countries and their energy demand into how global energy markets operate. So what I'm going to illustrate to you a little bit is the shift towards sustainable energy requires sustained efforts towards all of these different transitions. This illustration shows you that for developing countries, that opportunity for a leapfrog towards sustainable energy actually can take many different pathways. But it is those economies where we've got to concentrate our attention, because 88% of additional electricity demand until 2040 will come from emerging markets. So how do we do this? I want to first illustrate some of the how on utility scale renewables at scale. This graphic shows you how India's electricity system has shifted rapidly towards a cleaner electricity system, not nearly as clean as it needs to be. So 2010, the National Solar Mission began. We had less than 20 megawatts of solar at that time. Now India has the world's fifth largest solar market by deployed capacity, world's fourth largest wind market by deployed capacity, and overall the fourth largest renewable energy system in the world. Another way to look at it is over the last 10 years, power capacity has grown in India by 82%. Coal-based capacity has grown by 50%. Renewables capacity has grown by 388. So what needs to happen for economies where the energy demand curve is upward sloping rather than flat is that you've got to win the renewables game at the margin rather than a substitution effect for every single new electron should ideally or probabilistically greater than half should be coming from renewables. How do you do that? So one of the things, I mean, the agro-photovoltaic presentation was really interesting because many of these economies will struggle with land. But one of the innovations that India attempted was something called solar parks. Now, of course, it will not work in all parts of India and it will certainly not work in all parts of the developing world. But land pooling helped to provide an easier plug-and-play model for utility-scale renewable energy development, who would otherwise have struggled and taken a lot more time to find the land plots and then build out the infrastructure. So if a decade ago it took about 18 months to build, say, a 500 megawatt solar power plant, now it'll take less than 7 months. Precisely because that's the kind of public-private approach that was needed to ensure that the land pooling combined with the evacuation infrastructure was ready. Therefore, the evacuation infrastructure becomes equally important. We were just discussing during lunchtime, India has a more integrated grid than the United States. I was living in New York when the Northeastern grid collapsed 20 years ago. Right now, at least technically, we can wheel clean energy from down south in Tamil Nadu upwards north, wind power from the south, solar power from the west, hydropower from Bhutan, and so forth. In fact, I was in Sri Lanka just last week. We're trying to establish an interconnection from wind power in Sri Lanka to southern India. So about 10,000 circuit kilometers of transmission lines deployed, 9,700 kilometers of interstate transmission lines deployed. That was another innovation. And the third innovation was institutional. So the risks of investing in renewable energy in developing countries is a challenge. How do you mitigate some of the risks? In India, an institution was created, the Solar Energy Corporation of India, which served as an intermediary in signing the power purchase agreement with the project developer and a separate power sales agreement with the utility, which then inured the project developer from the financial situation of the utility. But utility scale renewables is not the only story. So can we scale small scale systems? So I'll just give 3 examples. One is in agriculture. India has already the largest number of solar-based irrigation systems deployed in the world. But the way it is trying to do that is many different routes. Route number 1 is about 10,000 odd systems that are completely decentralized. Another 2 million solar pumps, and then about 1.5 million that would be grid-connected solar irrigation. Those maps that you see is a tool that we developed at CEW, mapping every single district in India on 20 different parameters, from food cropping type, crop water level, the water level, the crop patterns, access to finance for farmers, etc., to determine where you would get the best return on investment for which business model of solar irrigation deployment. But it need not be only about the on-farm application. Off-farm, but in rural areas, we estimated that using clean energy for livelihood activity is a $50 billion market. What might be those technologies? Those pictures show you, it's from a program we launched called Powering Livelihoods, solar-based food dryers to reduce what Professor Ramanathan was talking about, food waste. In fact, not only does it reduce food waste, it increases the farmer's take-home income about 2x or 3x, because you're not doing distress sales in hot tropical areas. Solar-based power looms. Solar-based, my favorite example is solar-based hydroponics for cattle fodder. That itself is a $2 billion market where the commons have been taken over. So how do you grow cattle fodder on far lower water and land footprint basis? Oops. And a third is distributed energy in urban areas. Again, at lunchtime, we were discussing how utilities have an instinctive pushback against distributed energy. So we started working with utilities to see how do you design business models where utilities would make money, consumers would save money, and the losses would come down. And we designed business models for what we call the roofless, those who live in tower blocks. And then what we call the creditless, those who might have homes but are very poor to have a credit history. Based on some of the experiments we've been running across the country, now there is a nationwide program that has just been announced for 10 million homes to get rooftop systems, which alone would account for at least 30,000 megawatts of solar power. So you can take distributed energy and take it to scale. But then there is another dimension. So far of those different energy transitions, I've talked about no energy to energy, talked about cleaner energy, dirty energy to cleaner energy. I've talked about rural to urban dimensions of energy, but there is another dimension. It is that deeper integration into global energy market. Now think back half a century. We had the first oil shock, and it created an energy security architecture for the energy demanders of the past and for the energy fuels of the past. We now need an energy security architecture for the energy demanders of the future, i.e. the developing countries and emerging markets, and for the energy fuels of the future, solar, wind, batteries, minerals, etc. Let me just explain why. Some numbers we crunched when we were the strategic partner for India's G20 shows that if you look across the world, for solar PV, the number of countries that had concentrated imports, means they were reliant on very few countries for bulk of their solar PV imports, went up from 38 in 2012 to over 71 in 2021. For lithium-ion batteries, went up from 19 to 49. So even as countries are doubling down and now tripling down on their renewable energy targets, they are reliant on fewer and fewer kind of countries and sources from where to source these products. This is particularly problematic for low-income and low-middle-income and upper-middle-income countries. High-income countries, their dependence on those concentrated imports is about 60%. But for low and upper-middle-income countries, that is nearly 100% in many of these cases. So when we need to go into the hundreds of gigawatts of clean energy infrastructure that needs to be deployed, energy security considerations will begin to kick in. These are no longer just pilot demonstrations. This is about maintaining resilience in a different way. The same applies on innovation. Dan talked about innovation. Now, the G20 accounts for 85% of the patents for clean tech filed over the last 20 years. Within the G20, 5 countries account for 85% of the patents granted. So there is a huge concentration of clean tech IP. And this does not mean IP should be given away for free. You have to think about how do you create a new paradigm of technology co-development, which is not just pooling of financial resources, but technical resources, human resources, and most importantly, our geographies as the laboratories where new clean tech oriented towards the hot topics can be developed. And the same challenges arise for energy security from critical minerals. 15 countries account for 55% of the identified critical minerals for the clean tech transition. But within them, 70 countries, just a few countries account for more than 70% of the actual mined minerals. So unless, in fact, my home abuts the DR Congo embassy, so yes, I usually knock on their door. So yes, we need to now think of ways to not just dig up virgin mines. We have to think about circularity and beneficiation of critical minerals at source. And the final thing, I know I'm over time, and I'll just take a minute more. Final thing is we've had a session on air, but we need to link climate action with clean air. So in this room, apart from me, there are 3 more commissioners of a new global commission called Our Common Air. Soumya is one of the co-chairs, Maria Naira is sitting across, and behind me is Gina. Helen Clark is the other co-chair. And our proposition, which came out last month, was that you got to focus on not air pollution alone as a liability, but clean air as an economic asset. And then develop the financing strategy that combines climate action, public health, and air quality interventions as a new way to drive action. But in addition, I just came to the Vatican here from Paris, where yesterday there was the first clean cooking summit that the IEA conducted. And if we think about the clean cooking benefits for ambient air quality, in India alone, the push for LPG cylinders that we were talking about earlier has resulted in a 30% reduction in the annual PM 2.5 from domestic cooking. Or black carbon per household, at least the households that are using LPG as a primary fuel, 30% reduction in black carbon. So the huge potential for the air quality benefits from a completely different developmental push that has gender implications, equity implications, and so forth. So what am I saying? That there is more than one energy transition, and therefore we have to design for scale, but with business models that can be both large and small. That emerging markets and developing economies now need to become nodes and not just recipients in the interdependent and more diversified value in the clean energy story. In the process, they have to participate as co-developers of the new energy technologies with shared intellectual property. We've got to focus on the beneficiation and circularity of critical minerals, and we have to invest in clean air as a driver of both a public health good, but also private benefits for households and economies. Then we have some of the operational characteristics of the WAT principles that Dan provoked us with. Thank you.